Hey everyone, Robert here from Unincorporated. Thanks for joining us today for Higher Ed Happy Hour on LinkedIn Live. Very excited about today's discussion. As usual, we'll kind of give everybody a second to jump in, and then from there, Ian will kind of host this session of Higher Ed Happy Hour, and we'll see you back here in 60 seconds.
Welcome. I guess we're live. That music almost put me to sleep. Hopefully everybody's still with us. It's great. It's great to kickstart this conversation. I'm so pleased to be joined today with Brandi Lawless, who is the department chair and associate professor in the Department of Communication Studies for University of San Francisco. And C. Kyle Rudick, who is the associate professor and graduate coordinator in the Department of Communication and Media at the University of Northern Iowa. So, to set the stage here a little bit, these two brilliant minds, they have co-authored a peer-reviewed paper entitled Distinguishing the Right from Wrong, Knowledge, Curriculum, and Intellectual Responsibility. It's a pretty dense title, but the takeaway is that in this paper, they both propose that one of the major challenges facing higher education today is the market metaphor. And we're going to get into that. I'm really looking forward to digging into that. The influence of the market, as we know, has been long felt by higher education. And from my perspective, the clients and the colleges and universities we support, it actually appears to be increasing. This market pressure appears to be increasing at an accelerated pace. So I'm really eager to learn more about this and how we might address this concern by treating knowledge and education, these are your words, more as a process rather than a commodity. So Brandi, Kyle, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Awesome. So let's start at the highest, I guess, level we can, and then kind of work our way down. But in your view, what is the purpose of a university?
Yeah, well, in our work, we argue that the university is for broadening one's epistemological and axiological horizons. And we feel like we do that by teaching analytical and evaluative tools. Critical thinking, really. You'd be really hard pressed to find a university where critical thinking wasn't a required area of the general education.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right. And how would you then describe or kind of build out the value of education across maybe all segments in terms of, you know, what the faculty gets in return, what parents get in return, what students get in return? How do you see that value of higher education kind of working across those groups?
Yeah, I think that one way that you can approach this is to think about, you know, what humans are capable of, what our potential is, and then does education either work to broaden those horizons and help us reach our potential, or does it constrain those things? And so, you know, from our perspective, you know, the problems oftentimes with higher education is that due to lack of funding, due to crosswise sort of political wins, all these different things, it reduces the ability for higher education and education in general to help people reach whatever their potential is, and instead really tries to make people think that what they're getting from higher education is the best that what we have to offer, whenever we could actually offer so much more to the public and to parents and to students and to the society that we serve.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as you point out in your paper, this marketplace metaphor is one of like the contributing factors, if not the most important kind of culprit, the main culprit to this. What is the marketplace metaphor?
Sure. So we talk about this metaphor as one that describes the new era of the university, a neoliberal university where the student is a consumer or a customer. When you think of any marketplace, you go into a grocery store and there are aisles with lots of options of products that you can choose from. And we argue that this metaphor has been applied to the university, where students are consumers. There's branding. It's business-like. There's a bottom line. And in any marketplace metaphor, the customer is always right. So anybody can walk in and choose the exact product that they want. And we should offer all of those products because it is a large marketplace where we are driven by the consumer.
Right, right. And so just following that forward a little bit, if education is a commodity and students are seen as customers and there is an investment in branding and marketing, recruitment, why is this so harmful then? Why is it so harmful to the value, or why would this be so harmful to the learning experience?
Well, if we have to offer every idea, then the quality of knowledge erodes. We cannot promote critical thinking, evaluation tools, and therefore there's no quality control of knowledge. Anything goes. And then in addition to that, some of that erosion then harms individuals. So some of the topics that we talk about in our paper, for example, are the idea that there's large genetic differences between races and that those differences should translate into economic and political hierarchies. Should we really be teaching this when scientifically it's not true? But beyond that, it creates a hierarchy amongst individuals from different races, sexualities, genders, etc. Another idea that we talk about in our paper is, if we teach about the social construction of sexuality, do we also have to talk then about conversion therapy for gay individuals, even though we know that conversion therapy leads to increased levels of suicide for LGBT folks? So it leads to a level of harm that is completely destructive for individuals and erodes the entire system of quality control when it relates to knowledge.
I see. So the marketplace metaphor leads to harmful ideas finding their way into curriculum. Did I capture that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. Because if I'm a customer, I should be able to get the product that I want under the marketplace metaphor, even if that choice is not for sale due to its lack of quality.
Interesting. Now, I know you've proposed an alternative, right? The way that we can kind of address this marketplace metaphor. But before we get to that, I'm curious, do you see any upside to the marketplace metaphor? Are there places within the construction and design of knowledge and the delivery of knowledge where marketplace metaphor actually has an upside?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that the marketplace metaphor does is and what it was reacting to, especially during the 80s and 90s, whenever it was coming to prominence, was the very old school model of schooling, which was the instructor is always right? And students should just sit down, shut up, take notes, and that's how knowledge should be produced, right? You have this elite cadre of people who are dispensing knowledge onto students. And so the marketplace metaphor does combat that. It says that students do have rights, they have, and that they're ability to be consumers does and should push back on this idea of elitism. But what you might say is that, if the pendulum was too far one way, now the pendulum's too far the other way, where if knowledge is really just up for grabs from the highest bidder, whether that's students or wealthy donors or whoever it might be who has the money to see their ideas represented as valid or true knowledge, then all of a sudden we have a very large problem, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, it does feel like the pendulum has swung quite far in the opposite direction. But I appreciate the fact that you're coloring in some of those benefits. So let's get to what you propose, right? It's not all bad. In other words, like we do have a choice here. We have a different metaphor, if you will, that we can follow, and it's one that you refer to as quality control metaphor. So let's walk that back a little bit. What is the quality control metaphor? And obviously, how does this address the concerns or what's so harmful about the marketplace metaphor?
Yeah, so the quality control metaphor, one of the reasons that we were attracted to this is because people are so used to this idea of the marketplace that we wanted to find something that could kind of push against that while at the same time being intelligible and something that people could grasp onto, because the marketplace metaphor is so dominant right now. And so the quality control metaphor tries to do that by saying, look, rather than putting this overemphasis on the product of knowledge, right, as a commodity that people can buy, instead, let's put more emphasis on the process.
Right.
And so you might think of regulatory agencies or other types of organizations that look at products, whether that's your car or food or whatever, and says this is safe for human consumption or it's not. And what's important here is that those organizations aren't in the business of telling us what is good, right? Like they're not saying this is the right way to think, this is the right thing, this is the only thing that you can eat. Instead, it's here are the types of choices that you might make, but some choices are just so harmful that we can't allow those for public consumption, right? So the Ford Pinto of ideas, right? Like it's a dangerous contraption and people shouldn't drive it. So we don't let people drive that car anymore, right?
Yeah. Is there a slippery slope there, though, when we start to QC or in some way determine what is harmful and not harmful when it comes to ideologies or curriculum?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the ways that we try to address that is in sort of contradistinction to what I was just talking about, like with the FDA or other regulatory agencies, which are very centralized and wield an enormous amount of power. We propose that those sorts of regulatory function is best done by the ongoing conversations among scholars about what, as a group, scholars and people come to see as true or valid or reliable or credible information. And so it's less about empowering a small cadre of people and saying, you get to tell us what's good or bad, and instead making that more about what is the scholarly conversation, what do scholars generally believe, and then as a result, then we start to work backwards from that to, okay, then what can we offer curriculum-wise, right? So once we, for example, go through the scientific method and we say, look, there are different hypotheses for why the Earth is warming. One of those was volcanoes, right? Okay, we need to test that. We need to find out if that's true or not. Once we recognize that that's not the case, that actually global climate change is primarily human-driven, then we no longer teach the volcano hypothesis as a valid or reliable or credible thing, because it's not, right? We know that humans cause climate change.
Right. Okay. So just following that forward a little bit, I mean, we have the scientific method, we have the process of peer-reviewed research and publishing. it feels like quality control, this metaphor, is actually in play already, or is it not? Am I missing a distinction? So, because I really love this premise of how we can provide an alternative form of valuing education versus this marketplace, but it feels like quality control in many ways is already built within the design of our institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I would say is that, in our paper, what we land on is that marketplace metaphor gets weaponized against that, and that there are people in society, and in this case, in our current moment, it's particularly a lot of folks that ideologically are on the political right, particularly those that are on what we might call the alt-right or the far right, who are making arguments that by not teaching volcanoes, or by not teaching the biological hierarchy of race, or by not teaching these debunked and thoroughly discredited ideas and theories, that somehow that is censorship, that's an erosion of freedom of thought, that it's keeping people in the dark, and that we should teach the controversy. And our argument is that there's not a controversy here. There's not a controversy among the scholarly community on whether or not, white people and black people and other folks are just completely different in terms of our biological makeups that, should necessitate some sort of political hierarchy. Like that's a scurrilous idea. That's not something that we should be teaching in our classes. It's not censorship. It's just quality control.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And I guess there's this sense of it where we don't see many of those ideas being brought into classroom, but I'm assuming your experience lends you to believe that they're still there and that there is still this need to double down on quality control.
So most professors will tell you that we see that weaponization often in a few different ways. I know that there was an announcement sent out to faculty on my campus saying, just to let you know, there's a group on campus that just registered with student activities whose national goal is to record professors and take their words out of context and argue for their marketplace of ideas and censor what you're saying. And there's also websites like Rate My Professor, but beyond that, there's Professor Watch List that is funded by Turning Point USA, which is an alt-right organization, or at least a far-right organization, whose goal is to expose, quote, liberal professors. And so we see this weaponization being actualized in a variety of ways, where we get put on certain websites, or in both the case of Kyle and I, our work has been criticized very vocally, and we suffer a lot of trolling.
Yep. I remember you shared that with us in the green room in the pre-interview. Mm-hmm. And that's unfortunate. That's unfortunate that your ideas aren't being readily accessible and evaluated based on those same standards that you're promoting. So going back to this paradigm between marketplace and quality control, is it possible for them to coexist? Because we are under a lot of pressure to show return on investment when it comes to education in terms of career outcomes. We're under a lot of pressure to backfill our enrollments, right? And make sure that every student placement is filled. So is there a place where both of these can the pendulum swing back to the middle in some way or not?
Right. So you heard Kyle talking about that pendulum swinging from one direction all the way to the other direction. And in some ways, yes, the marketplace of ideas is there, and it's a response to something in the university and in society at large. But it would be challenging to have both even equally, because the marketplace reinforces a business model, which is always already problematic. Anytime you create a business model, there are consumers who will argue that the customer is always right. And there will always be people challenging quality control mechanisms.
Right.
And I think to Brandy's point, a really good example of this is particularly like the Koch Foundation or other, again, corporate sponsors, particularly on the right, who have been have had a lot of publicity on them, basically purchasing professor lines, funding research that is contrary to the accepted opinion that, or not opinion, to the established fact that humans drive climate change, right? So like, if this idea, if the idea is that the university is not a public good, but is instead something that's private, it's part of the marketplace that is up for sale, then it lends itself to this sort of abuse. And, that's always going to be contrary to the sort of long arc of history and the long arc of human progress, because you have to have true and valid knowledge in order for us to advance.
Yeah. Yeah. In a way, you can buy your ideas into a placement, but I'm still not quite clear yet on how. I mean, what would you say to an administrator who is responsible for recruiting students, or what would you say to a parent who's about to make the significant investment in an education for their child, or a student who's about to encumber all of this debt? How do you address their concerns that this needs to lead to a career or better market placement for themselves?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I mean, and I think that first, I think that there are two different audiences here that we're speaking about, right? So the first one is the sort of immediate student, parents, administrators who are very much burdened by how the current marketplace metaphor has created these pressures for them. I think the student debt crisis is a really great example of this, right? Sure. This idea that it's higher education is a personal investment in myself and in my future, and I need to go on average $35,000 in debt in order for me to actualize myself. And so for that person right now, what we would say is that, it's important for you, to make those choices, right? Make those, make sure that your university has enrollments, make sure that, that you're making wise economic choices on which university to go to, stuff like that.
Sure.
But that and this is the second audience, but you need to be thinking about how this is creating this problem that's only going to get worse as we continue to double down on this metaphor and on this ideology as a way of running higher education. And that unless and until we start moving towards this other way of thinking, and we start thinking of the university as a public good, then we're not going to get away from the types of problems that you're expressing right now.
Yep. Yeah, that's very fair and a noble response. Brandi, any other thoughts on that? Because it's a concern we hear a lot from our clients, and as a father of 3 children, I start to worry about the investment and the value that higher education, beyond just being a transformative experience for the individual and leading to ascension from an intellectual and spiritual place, philosophical place, that it also needs to have a return in terms of them being able to provide for themselves and their future family. So, Brandi, anything else to add to that?
I'd add that when you survey employers about what makes a good employee or what they're looking for, it isn't the hard skills. It's actually, can they think critically? Can they work in groups? Can they communicate in oral and written forms? And these are the things that we're talking about when we say we can teach analytical and evaluative tools and have people ask larger questions, which actually make them more flexible and better to work with.
Yeah, that's so true. So I see a few questions coming in where the time has gone by like in a snap of the finger. I know that people will want to read this paper and really dig in a little bit further, where's the best place to access this body of research?
So there's probably a paywall, unfortunately, on the journal for this. So contacting either myself or Kyle would be the best way to get this paper for free.
Excellent. Excellent. And don't contact them if you're going to troll them. That's not what we're advocating here. Yes. Yes. Okay. So a couple more questions. One more question from myself, and then there's a question here from the panel that I want to get to. But it comes back to this big question about the future of education, right? So if you're scanning the headlines, there's lots of debates of where higher education is moving, how we're unbundling. Some thought leaders are saying that we need to unbundle education. There needs to be digital certifications or digital credentials that remove the need for a bachelor, master's degree, or PhD. So in your view, what does the future of higher education look like?
Well, it depends on how you're asking that question, because what does it look like and what do I want it to look like?
Okay, that's fair. Let's take on both then.
I do think that what it will look like is that it will continue to be commodified. I think the university, unfortunately, will continue to be run like a business. Things are getting more and more expensive, and people want specific things, and they continue to ask why they have to take all the other classes.
Right.
I think those other classes are important. What do I want it to look like? I want it to look like a community of knowledge production, where we teach people to ask those bigger questions, where we ask people to evaluate their values and to think how those values are linked to larger social problems.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Kyle, how about you?
I think that, in a lot of ways, I'll echo Brandi here on where I think it's going and what I would like. In terms of how I think it's going, I think that in many ways, higher education is seeing in many ways a parallel of what has been going on in our K through 12 schools, which is to say that our K through 12 schools are increasingly becoming battlegrounds ideologically. They're increasingly becoming overmanaged by state and federal mandates, and teachers themselves are becoming more and more de-skilled in the sense of having their professional autonomy stripped away from them, and being given scripted curriculum, scripted sort of talking points and stuff like that. What's interesting about that is that what I think that you'll see in higher education is this, which is to say, if you see the difference between where the very wealthy, where the rich send their children to school, and what they do in those schools, and then what happens in your average public school, there's light years of difference.
Sure.
And so whenever you say, here's what people are thinking higher education should be like, oftentimes what I hear there is, here's what higher education should look like for millions of middle class and working class people. But what is going to probably be largely unchanged in many ways are those elite schools, right? Because that will secure them a differentiation in the marketplace of what their credentialing looks like, and then we'll give them access to things that higher education should be a place where we level that playing field, but will instead reinforce those inequalities.
Yeah. So you see that there'll be a perpetuation of like a premium. That's we sometimes refer to this as a brand equity. Some degrees, some institutions will have a higher premium or a higher perceived brand equity than other forms of credentialing.
Absolutely, right. And so we at my own university and others, they've been talking about like micro credentialing, right? And I can see the flexibility of that, right? I can see the appeal of it, but I also worry that micro credentialing or other types of bundles or online platforms and stuff like that does lend itself to the ability to create different tiers of service, different tiers of access, which in turn undermines, and this is to the future-oriented point, what I wish higher education was, which is a place where people could reach and understand what their potential is. That if a person comes into a university, that they can play a musical instrument, they can read, philosophers, philosophy stuff, that they can work on their writing, that they can find how to write, TPS reports and management reports, that they can experience all those things, and then from that make an informed choice about how they want to live their life, rather than it being a matter of access and how much you can pay for.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't want the C class, the S class, and the E class of education. We don't want those tiers, and we don't also want to put so much pressure on the learner that they must find work. They must have a career objective in mind as they discover themselves and as they go through that process. Brandi, I think it was you actually who said, if we could focus just more on process versus product, right? And I think in this way we've described the future of higher education, in an ideal state, it would be about process versus the product. Is that right?
Go ahead, Kyle.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. I just want to say one thing real quick that I think connects to this as well, which is, something that I think that we also often have in the United States is this idea of like, you go to the university for 4 years, between 18 and 22, you get your degree, and then you figure out what you want to do for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
And that's it. Like unless you get lucky, like most people never darken the doorway of a university again. And this goes to Brandi's point about seeing the university as a community of knowledge and knowledge production. What would it mean to make our universities places that, if I'm a 55-year-old person and I just want to take a class on, the philosophy of whatever, I could just walk into a university, get registered, and just take a class because I want to learn something, right? Yeah. And that, I think, is the sort of ideal that at least I would really like to see.
And that actually exemplifies the definition of a process. A process has no clear start and no clear end. It's ongoing. And so education can exist within 4 years or however many years somebody stays. Rather, it is about development of understanding your value system, how knowledge is produced, how you can better critique, how you can better analyze the information that's coming to you from all angles, and then make informed decisions.
Yep. That is so well said. So we're a little over time, but there is one question. I think it's a relevant question that came in, and relevant in the sense that EDI or DEI is, something that we have to put focus on and attention. So the question is, diversity has become a way to market the university, right? Showing diversity in the web pages, the marketing collateral. But they point out, if we don't show diversity, we're also at fault. So in what ways, when it comes to external communications, what ways, I guess, could they do this more authentically?
So one thing that I would say, and that I've written about elsewhere, is not to rise to the level of what we would call neoliberal multiculturalism, which is the idea that you advertise this diversity, but then you don't support diverse faculty, diverse students, diverse communities once they get to the university. And you don't let yourself be changed by those diverse ideas. So there has to be some support systems in place that shows that you're walking a walk in addition to talking a talk, not just appealing to diversity, but also engaging in issues of diversity.
Yeah. So do a little more internal work, and to make sure that the house is in order in terms of diversity, inclusion, equity, before you go out and champion it and put that seal on your marketing material. Yeah, that's
and
great.
I think that, to Brandi's point, like the most important thing is, if you're going to say that, diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, these are principles that your organization or your department or whatever it is are really in, for or, want to promote, then you have to be in a place where you have to be just as vulnerable to be changed by those different perspectives as those perspectives have been changed by the dominant culture, right? And so
Yeah.
it's not a matter of just mix and stir, right? Let's just get some more of X type of person into what we were already doing anyway, but really putting yourself in a place where your organizational culture is going to change.
Yeah. And I see a direct connection to the idea of process in that statement too, right? It's a organizational process that you have to go through, and there is a bit of evolution that's required before you can attain that next kind of major milestone for your faculty group or your student group. You can't just mix and stir. It's excellent. So what's the best way to reach out and connect with you? How would people want to learn more and connect with you further? What's the best way to do so?
You can Google us, find our email addresses. Mine is bjlawless@usfca.edu. And I have a faculty page. It's easy to find my information. Reach out, shoot me an email. I'm happy to engage more.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And similar, so my email address is kyle.rudick, RUDICK, at uni.edu. And then you can find me on academia.edu or ResearchGate. And yeah, reach out to me. I'm happy to talk.
That's awesome. Thank you for being accessible. Thank you for spending your time to champion these ideas. I think it's really helpful to hear this discourse and get this perspective. We're all in this together in many ways, and I just can't thank you enough for being a part of it.
Thanks for having us and giving us the opportunity to explain some of these concepts.
Yeah,
Absolutely.